Let us take a look at the chambers of the heart, and then we'll look at some of the exterior landmarks. In the next section, we'll start to talk about the blood vessels. There are two sets of chambers, the superior chambers, the upper chambers, or the atria. There's one on the right, there's one on the left. They are the receiving chambers. Their walls are relatively thin. They are made of muscle, but they're relatively thin. They are exceedingly expandable. They will be separated by the interatrial septum, inter between atrial for the chambers and septum for wall. They will receive blood from veins. Remember that veins bring blood towards the heart. They really contract a minimal amount in order to move blood into the ventricles. They are relatively passive. It's really only the last third of the movement of the blood into the ventricles that is under any pressure. And there is an expandable extension, which is known as the auricle, which we'll see later on in this section. The ventricles are the ones that are going to have a much thicker wall. They are the inferior chambers, the lower chambers. They're going to be separated by a relatively thick wall, the interventricular septum. Remember, septum means wall. They are active and are going to pump blood from the heart off into arteries. When we look at the images, I want you to make sure you take a look at the trabeculae carnae, which are going to be these sort of irregular ridges and folds along the inner surface of the ventricles. They will include what's known as the moderator band, which is a ridge, which is going to contain part of the very important cardiac conduction system. Because of that, they will coordinate contractions of cardiac myocytes, muscle cells. Myocytes is a fancy term for muscle cells. You can see the atria are superior and the ventricles are inferior. The right atrium will move blood into the right ventricle, and the left atrium is going to move blood into the left ventricle. It's atria to ventricle, not atria to atria. Atria to ventricle, either on the right or on the left. Conveniently, this is color-coded, so you can see that the right side is associated with deoxygenated blood, and the left side is going to be associated with oxygenated blood. The right side of the heart is associated with deoxygenated blood, which is going to go off into pulmonary circulation, and the left side of the heart is going to be associated with oxygenated blood, which will go off to systemic circulation. So let's take a look-see. This is actually going to be the right ventricle, and this will be the left ventricle. You can see the interventricular septum here. You can see the trabeculae carnae, those ridges and folds. And we'll also talk about these, known as chorda tendineae, and papillary muscles, which are going to attach to those chorda tendineae. We'll talk about the valves and the pulmonary trunk of the superior vena cava later. Now, blood flow through the heart. Let me repeat that the right side of the heart will pump blood, deoxygenated blood, into the pulmonary circuit. The left side of the heart will pump blood, oxygenated blood, into the systemic circuit. Please remember this. Equal volumes of blood will be pumped to both circuits simultaneously. The two sides are going to have different workloads, though. Why is that? Because the right side is only pumping off to the lungs, which are right there, neighbors to the heart, and the left side has to pump blood all the way around the rest of the body. Because of that, the wall of the right ventricle is going to be thinner. The wall of the right ventricle will be thinner than the wall of the left ventricle. The wall of the left ventricle is going to be 3 times thicker than the wall of the right ventricle. because it needs to generate a much greater pressure in order to overcome the much greater resistance that you find with regards to systemic circulation. So, again, the myocardium of the left ventricle is significantly thicker than that of the right ventricle. Both atria accept the same volume of blood. The same volume of blood will move from the atria into the ventricles, and both ventricles will pump the same volume of blood. It has to be. Now, let me repeat this. The left ventricle has to pump blood off the systemic circulation. So because of that, it has to generate much greater force, much greater pressure to overcome the resistance of getting all that blood off to the periphery. So the wall of the left ventricle will be much thicker than the one on the right. Let's take a look at that. So here is the right ventricle. Here is the left ventricle. The wall in between them, this guy right here, is known as the interventricular septum. Take a look at the wall of the right ventricle and take a look at the wall of the left ventricle. This pumps off to the lungs. This pumps off to systemic circulation. Pulmonary circulation, systemic circulation. So when you are looking at a heart, what I need you to do is this. The very first thing you're going to do is orient yourself to where you are in the heart by figuring out what is the left ventricle. And the way that you do that is to determine which has the thickest wall. As soon as you figure out which one is the left ventricle, then you can figure out which is the right ventricle and which is the left atrium and which is the right atrium. So a couple of other landmarks I want you to see. We've already talked about the trabeculae carnae, and I mentioned the chorda tendineae, which are marked here, and you can see papillary muscles here and here. We'll talk about the rest of these later, and then you can refer back to this lovely image once we've discussed those. This shows you a great drawing, very simplified, of the difference in the thickness of the walls of the right and left ventricles. Please remember that they will contain and pump out the same volume of blood. By definition, they have to. Another image, left ventricle versus right ventricle. And this, I like this because it shows you when the walls are relaxed and when the walls are contracted. So let's look at some of the exterior landmarks. You need to know about the coronary sulcus. That's going to be a relatively deep groove that you're going to find in between the atria and the ventricles. You will often see adipose there. Here is the auricle, which I mentioned, auricle of the right atria. That's just an extension of the atria. I'm going to start to talk a little bit about the great vessels. This is going to be the superior vena cava, which will bring deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. This will be the pulmonary trunk, which will bring deoxygenated blood out of the right ventricle. And here is the aorta. This little short piece is the ascending aorta. Part that's chopped off here is the arch of the aorta, and this will be the first part of the descending aorta. So here is the anterior interventricular sulcus. Inter for between, ventriculus for ventricles, sulcus. It's a relatively shallow depression that's going to help you figure out which is the right and left ventricle. Conveniently on the anterior aspect of the heart, hence the name anterior interventricular sulcus. And this shows you a cadaver heart. Right ventricle, left ventricle, anterior interventricular sulcus, and right in through here, it's going to be the coronary sulcus. Here's the right atrium, here's the auricle of the right atrium. This is going to be the ascending aorta, the aortic arch or arch of the aorta. This will be the pulmonary trunk, which will divide into the left and right, you can't see the right, pulmonary artery. And we'll talk about the rest of these later. Actually, let me mention this guy. The coronary arteries, these guys, the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. The right and left coronary arteries are the first two branches off the aorta. Let me repeat that. The right and left coronary arteries are the first two branches off the aorta. The heart feeds itself first. The most oxygen-rich blood from the left ventricle gets routed off to the heart itself. The heart feeds itself first. So the very first branches off the aorta are the right and left coronary arteries. You'll hear that again. Here's the coronary sinus. That's going to be important because it will collect blood from the coronary veins and will feed that deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. We'll talk about the other landmarks, specifically the great vessels, later on in a separate section. This shows you the posterior interventricular sulcus. What does it do? It's going to be the posterior boundary between the ventricles. You do need to know about the ligamentum arteriosum. It is a remnant of what is known as the ductus arteriosus in the fetus. When you talk about fetal circulation, you will have blood. You're going to have a blood vessel that connects the main pulmonary artery to the aorta, which means that most of the blood from the right ventricle is going to bypass the fetus's lungs because they are fluid-filled and non-functioning. And there it is, ligamentum arteriosum. We also need to talk about the fossa ovalis, which is the location of what's known as the foramen ovale in the fetus. There is a foramen, which is a fancy word for hole, in between the atria and the fetus because you want the blood to pass between the atria and bypass pulmonary circulation during fetal development. It's going to close at birth. In most infants, it closes within the first 6 months or so. And there it is. Let's talk about the valves. There will be two sets of valves. The atrioventricular valves are conveniently going to be between the atria and the ventricles. The tricuspid valve is between the right atrium and the right ventricle. The bicuspid valve, which is also known as the mitral valve, is going to be between the left atrium and the left ventricle. When the heart is relaxed, those AV valves are going to hang loosely down into the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, blood is forced up against the flaps of those AV valves and will push them closed. And you can see that here. You can see how they're snapping closed in that lovely animation. And that shows you the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve. The structures that are going to be associated with the AV valve are the chorda tendineae, which we saw. They are tendon-like cords, fibrous connective tissue. They will connect the cusps of both the AV valves to the papillary muscles of the ventricles. They will prevent those cusps from swinging back up into the atria. And you also need to know about the papillary muscles, which are going to be located on the inner surface of the ventricles. And this shows you the chorda tendineae right here and the papillary muscles here and here. And love it, an image, photograph, fantastic. We need to talk about the semilunar valves. They will be located at the base of the arteries that exit the heart. Their job is to prevent backflow of blood into the ventricles. You have one at the aorta, which is known as the aortic semilunar valve. You can call it the aortic valve, but I like sticking that semilunar in there so you remember they are semilunar valves. And there will be one that is the pulmonary semilunar valve, which is going to prevent backflow into the right ventricle. When the pressure in the ventricle rises above the pressure in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, those semilunar valves are forced open, which means that blood will be ejected from the heart. When the ventricles relax, blood will flow backwards into the heart and actually get caught in those cusps of the semilunar valves, and it'll close them. There are no valves at the entrances of the vena cava or the pulmonary veins. Instead, the blood has a relative inertia, and the atria sort of collapse on themselves during contraction, and that will minimize backflow into those vessels. And that shows you the semilunar valve, pulmonary semilunar valve, and the aortic semilunar valve. And another image.